I was one of the Native American children, adopted at birth and removed from our country's Indian reservation system. I was raised in a small middle-class farming community, but was never told of my true American Indian heritage. It was still taboo back in those early days. The years passed, and in 1987 I lost both parents. While going through their personal belongings, my wife discovered my adoption papers and she began a search. 5 years later, I was reunited with my biological Lakota family living on the Lower Brule Sioux Indian Reservation of South Dakota. I am a son of two mothers and a product of two worlds that had collided. But I have an equal amount of love and pride for both. I'm Paul LaRoche, and the stories you are about to see are an attempt to share this true American story of a hidden heritage. Welcome to this episode of Hidden Heritage. I'm your host, Paul LaRoche. One of the things that I've enjoyed the most in the years of traveling with our music group Brule was meeting other American Indian musicians. In the overall greater music industry, Native American musicians make up a small percentage. And there is definitely more contemporary Native musical artists for sure, whose various styles include rock, hip-hop, rap, country, and others. The traditional musicians tend to be mostly flute players and traditional drummers and singers, and a lot of them are on the powwow circuit. Back in 2009, while touring throughout the Midwest, I met a traditional flute player with a long family history in music. He is from the Comanche tribe of Oklahoma, and his name was Dennis Tate Navequaya. He was the grandson of the late and well-known Doc Tate Navequaya. Here is that interview.
My name is Dennis Tate Navequaya. That's DennisTateNevaquaya. I am from the Comanche, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw nations. I was born Comanche and raised Comanche, but I also, I accept my other tribal affiliations, because that was on my grandmother's side. The Comanches are from the southwestern part of Oklahoma, between Oklahoma and Texas, but once we were a part of the Shoshones. We were once one band. The story goes, there were two sides, and one side decided to leave, and they became known as the Comanches or the Numina. Numina in my language is how we say my tribe. It means the people. That's the correct definition of the word Numina. Well, actually, the flute came to my family through my grandfather, the late Doc Tate Navequaya. And it was, when he was a younger boy, he was orphaned by his family, by his parents. They died within a year of each other. So he was sent to these boarding schools. And when he was in high school, he went to Fort Sill Indian School. And while he was in high school, he had wanted to join they had a dance troupe, and he had wanted to learn how to dance, and he wanted to dance with these other kids. So he went to a pawn shop in Lawton, Oklahoma, and he had purchased a regalia. When he had got back to his dormitory, he had opened up the suitcase and started looking through it, looking at the regalia that he'd bought. And he had noticed at the bottom of this suitcase, there was a pipe metal flute that was in there, So he picked it up, kind of looked at it, searched it and looked at it, and he started to play it. And he had remembered this sound as a young man, He said that he would be sitting there at the Native American, or the American Indian Fair, the Indian Fair, which is in Anadarko. And he says he remembers hearing this soothing melody that would be coming from throughout the campground. And that's, where he learned his interest, and that's where he first became interested in the Native American flute. It was in the 1960s and 1968 when he went to the Smithsonian Institute to study and to research this flute. And at that time of his studying, there was only 5 flute players that were known throughout the United States. One was Chief Shenandoah, who was of the Winnebago tribe. The other was Richard Fool's Bull, who was of the Rosebud Sioux. One was Eddie Wap, who was Sac and Fox and Comanche. The fourth one, I can't remember his name. And then there was my grandfather, Doc Tate Navequaya, and he was the youngest. So throughout his research and throughout his studying, they say this flute, this instrument here, would have been a lost art. It had not been for my grandfather's research and love of this flute and this melody, They say that each tribe, I know, like the Sioux, they have their own legend and their lore of how the flute came to their people. Each tribe has their own way of how this flute came amongst their people. And the Comanches, they have one too. And the Comanche legend goes that there was this man who had lost his family, his wife and his children, to a battle along this pond, and he'd sit there and he'd cry. and he would sit there and mourn for his wife and his children because he missed them. And every day the wind would blow and he would hear the soothing melody and it would calm his spirit. So he became very interested in knowing where this sound was coming from. So he started walking amongst the trees where he had heard this sound. He had crawled up into this cedar tree and he noticed there was this branch that had been hollowed out, and then there was holes that were made through it from a woodpecker. So he kind of picked it up and he broke that branch off, and he noticed that there was like a chamber that flowed through it, and he took it back to his campground. He began to study it and experiment with it, trying to make that same sound that he had heard that calmed his spirit. Well, he had started to mess with it and started to experiment with it, and he started to play it. And he started to put like a piece of wood on top of it to kind of match that sound. And when he did, that's how the flute became amongst the Comanche tribe. It was through that man's mourning, In the 1960s, because there was no written legend or no written lore, there was no written history on the Comanches, stories were handed down from generation to generation. And as you know, as I do, when stories get told from one person to another, they get switched up and they get changed up. Well, in the 60s, it was considered a taboo to play this flute, this instrument, because the stories had been changed and twisted. But my grandfather had remembered the stories that he had heard from his elders, and how this flute come along. It was it would help somebody. Okay, let's take it back.
No, it's okay. You can start wherever you want. Just jump right in wherever you want.
My grandpa had remembered these stories that he had heard from his elders, of how this flute came to our people. And it was a calming, soothing melody that helped ease the spirit, or helped ease somebody's pain of a lost loved one. So that's how this flute came to my people, trying to make that same sound that he had heard that calmed his spirit. Well, he had started to mess with it and started to experiment with it, and he started to play it. And he started to put like a piece of wood on top of it to kind of match that sound. And when he did, that's how the flute became amongst the Comanche tribe. It was through that man's mourning, In the 1960s, because there was no written legend or no written lore, there was no written history on the Comanches, stories were handed down from generation to generation. And as you know, as I do, when stories get told from one person to another, they get switched up and they get changed up. Well, in the 60s, it was considered a taboo to play this flute, this instrument, because the stories had been changed and twisted. My grandpa had remembered these stories that he had heard from his elders, of how this flute came to our people. And it was a calming, soothing melody that helped ease the spirit, or helped ease somebody's pain of a lost loved one. So that's how this flute came to my people. The technology that we have today, it's easier to make a recording today than it was back in, say my grandfather's time or Richard Foolsbull's time. It was considered a lost art. Nobody ever heard about it. But this flute, like you said, this flute is known as the only melody-making instrument that was ever found amongst the Native Americans. This is the only instrument. And we have the drum, but that's not a melody-making instrument. The flute is, And so people, when they pick up the flute, it's easy for anybody just to go out and say, well, I want to play the flute. I want to make a recording. To where it's a long time ago, it wasn't that easy, People had to go see people, had to meet people, had to know people. Yeah, and to where nowadays you could just go on the internet, record yourself on the internet, and a couple of days later you have a recording, Like I've been asked questions, and people, it's real funny to me, because I played the trumpet in high school, and I know how to read music. And then when people look at me and they see my flutes, they'll say, well, what key is that flute in? And I'm like, I have no idea, because like my grandfather, he played by ear. He played what he remembers hearing, And that's the same way I play, And like he always used to tell me, if a flute will play the song Amazing Grace, then that's a good flute. And that's what he based his flute scale on, was that one song. But I was asked that question before, somebody said, if your grandpa was alive today, would he be proud of what you're doing? And my answer is yes, he would, because I am actually carrying on his tradition, his legacy, by playing the flute, by learning how to make the flute. And it's actually a funny story on how I learned how to make the flute and play the flute. I actually learned to make the flute and play it by default. When I was 12 years old, I was in the 4-H program in these grade schools. And I had 4-H project due. And I had probably a month or two, before I knew that I had to do my project. But me being the type of kid I waited till last minute. So the day before my project was due, I went up to my grandfather, I said, hey, Grandpa, I said, I have 4-H project due tomorrow. I said, do you think you can help me out? And he kind of looked at me and said, well, what do you want to do? So, well, do you think you can teach me how to make and play a flute? And he started laughing, And he looked at me and said, are you crazy? I can't teach you how to make and learn how to play a flute in one day. I was like, well, that was what I was wanting to do. He said, well, why didn't you come to me earlier? I could have taught you this. So I kind of got disappointed. I had my head down, and he kind of seen the disappointment in my face. He said, well, I said, I'll tell you what. He said, I'll tell you the basics of the flute. He said, I'll teach you a quick song. He said, but you got to promise to come back and learn how to make this flute. He said, you got to come back and learn the history behind it. So I did, I went the next day and went to my 4-H project. I went and told them the basic of a flute, told them, what it was about, what it represented. I played them my flute song, and I got best of show. And I did keep my promise. I did go back and I did learn how to make the flute. And I did learn how to play it, and I did learn the significance of it. I learned the meaning of it, and how it came about to my people and to my grandfather. But when I was growing up, my grandfather, everybody always used to tell me how famous he was and everything he did. But to me, he was my grandpa. That's all I knew him was grandpa. But it wasn't until I was older that I learned all the accomplishments and all the things that he had done, Like I'd never known that my grandfather was knighted by the Queen of England. I'd never known that until 4 or 5 years ago. I was reading some of his papers, some of his art awards and stuff. And he was knighted by the Queen of England in 1971, along with George Woodgee Watchtaker. He also had played his flute in Windsor Palace, and he also played his flute in front of the House of Parliament. In 1985. No, it was 1986. The state of Oklahoma, they had a commemorative coin during the 75th anniversary of the state of Oklahoma, their 75th birthday. They had commemorated a coin, and on both sides of this coin was my grandfather's artwork. And that was pretty, that was, how would you say, that was kind of touching to me, because I never realized how big my grandfather was. In 1995, a year before my grandfather passed away, the state of Oklahoma named him a living treasure to the state. And that was really something to me and my family. And to this day, when I think about my grandpa, I really miss him. I miss the teachings that he used to give me, because he was a man's man. He always taught me, don't be afraid to speak your mind. Don't be afraid to tell people how you feel. It's good to show emotions, and that's one thing he taught me. He installed a lot of good qualities in me, and that's the way I try to live my life, is how he lived his life. This is actually a song that this is for my 2 daughters. I have 2 daughters. One is 18 and the other one is 10, and when I get real lonesome from, I used to play this song. So this is my daughter's song. I have a 18-year-old daughter named Mariah Michelle Navequaya, and I have a 10-year-old daughter named Aiden Tate Navequaya. The flute's taken me a lot of places that I never thought I would ever go or I would ever be. Like when my grandfather won the National Endowment of the Arts Award in 1986 from President Ronald Reagan, he had a one-man art show the same time when they were having his reception. So what had happened was me and my mom went to go fill in for him and to not accept this award, but to fill in for him at his reception. And I was 14 years old, and I went and stood in front of my grandfather's place, and I played the flute for for all the senators in the U.S. Capitol building, and it's taken me places, and it's also kind of like a soothing for me to hear this melody, to play it. It helps me relax, and it also helps me think of the good times and the good things, that my grandpa taught me. So it's kind of like a healing for me, and for as well as my family. It's given my family the name recognition. And it's helped my uncles. Like I said, I have 4 uncles who also play and make the flute. And it's helped them in their lifetime. Go places, see things. Do things that they probably never would have done if it had not been for my grandfather or this instrument here. I believe it's very important to carry on my grandfather's legacy, because to me, this was a lost art, and he had a lot to do with reviving this flute. That's actually what he won the National Endowment of the Arts Award for, was reviving this. It was a lost. Nobody knew how to make them. They knew how to play them, but nobody knew how to make them. So I believe that it is important for me to carry on this tradition, because it's good to know where these things came from and how they came about. So for me, it is good to carry on this tradition, and it's good to carry on my name, because my grandfather, he built a legacy, and I believe it's very important to carry on his legacy, to teach people about these, because if you don't, then people aren't ever going to know where these things came from. They're not going to know the truth, And it's always good to know the truth about how these instruments came to our people, not just the Comanches, but also the other tribes, such as the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Sioux, the Navajo, the Winnebago. All these tribes, they all have their own lore and their own legend of how this flute came to them, And I believe it's important, to each person, as a tribal member, as a Native American, to learn where these things came from. So that's why I carry on this tradition, And I just love playing the flute. I love what my grandfather did, It was a soothing sound that it could calm anybody's spirit. It could help them, man. Maybe me telling a person about this flute, playing this flute, will help somebody else out in some other way. Maybe they have something that's in their heart, that's bothering them. Maybe they might hear me play the flute, or they might hear one of my grandfather's recordings or somebody's recordings, Maybe it'll help soothe that feeling that they have, So that's why I do it. That's why I play this flute. That's why I carry on this tradition.
Thank you for joining us today on Hidden Heritage. I'm your host, Paul LaRoche, reminding you that if you enjoyed the podcast, share us with your friends and help us spread the word. Till next time, from all of us in Brule, thank you.